I wish so much that I could turn you all into programmers in 1 week. I'm sorry to say it. I knew from the beginning that was a futile effort. I'm just trying to help you get a solid foundation so that when you teach yourselves to program, it won't be that hard and you can pull it off. That's really what's going on here. One of the hardest things to do in breaking into any field is understanding the terminology. I thought it might be productive to just review some terminology really fast with you. Want to do some words? Give your mind a break from programming so it can recover for what we're doing after this. Here's a bunch of words. What the heck does it mean to instantiate?
To create an instance.
Yeah, it's when you make a new object. When you find a place in memory that isn't being used and you say, that memory is mine. You stake it out and you start filling it with values and say, that piece of memory is now my object. That's instantiating. To instantiate is to create an instance of a class. So for example, if your class is dog, then to instantiate would be to give birth to Fido and train it to do tricks or something like that. Okay, so make a new object. Well, I guess you could say it's to allocate and initialize a new object, is to instantiate a class. Classes are instantiated, and when you instantiate a class, it results in an object of that class. Okay. In Java, all classes have a constructor, and if you don't make a constructor, it adds one for you. And the job of a constructor is to initialize. Now, you could write the constructor so that it doesn't do its job, but I guess by default, everything gets initialized in Java. There are languages that don't initialize things, and they tend to be more problematic. So one of the contributions of Java is they force everything to be initialized. What does initialize mean? It kind of sets the first value or something like that. I hope you're not just copying my wording, because that isn't well thought through wording. That's just the first thing that pops into my head to describe it. But the idea is when you use an equal sign to set the value for the first time for a variable, that's initializing. Okay? Constructors initialize all the member variables. You do it yourself when you use an equal sign to initialize a variable you just declared. What does it mean to allocate? Let's find some free memory and claim it. Yeah, use it for an object. Allocating and instantiating are kind of the same thing, and I guess instantiation is both allocating and initialization, if we're being technical. What does it mean to declare? Yeah, this is how we make variables. And what's the difference between a variable and an object? Yeah, a variable holds a value or a reference to an object. Objects hold a bunch of values. Basically, an object has a bunch of variables in it, which could themselves be primitive variables. Ooh, there's another one. Let's add primitive type and class type to our list. Wow, the list is growing as we do it. This will never end. Declaring is when you make a variable. Essentially, it's int I, semicolon. That's a variable declaration. What is a call? That's when you tell it to do a function or procedure or method or whatever we're calling them. To call something is to say, that's the example of you're at this step in the recipe and suddenly you need a pie shell. Go do that recipe that produces a pie shell, and then now you're back. Pour your topping you just made into the pie shell. It's hold everything, go do that function, then when you're done, now we're here. Okay. What is Boolean? This is a primitive type. It can be true or false. It has only two values. All conditions evaluate to a Boolean. A conditional is something that's an if or evaluates to Boolean. Sure. Nope, I can't. I'm at the top. Oh, you mean just so you can see what's at the bottom of the screen? Because, yeah, sorry. think that scrolled down, except it made everything move up. That's confusing. Sorry.
That's what I meant. Can we make this?
Yeah, I scrolled down to make the screen move up so you can, okay. A primitive type is any of int, boolean. Most languages, they just call it bool. Java, you have to write out the whole darn thing. I hate that. Short, long, which you'll never use. Double, floats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 8 of them. Char and byte. Byter, if you prefer. No, not if you prefer. It's just byte.
All of those are.
These are the primitive types. These are all of the primitive types. There are no more. Therefore, if it's not in this list, it's not a primitive type.
String is class, right?
String is technically a class, but it's designed to act like a primitive type. So you know how there's Y is kind of a vowel? String is kind of like a primitive type, but it's not really. And there's also references which are sort of like primitive types. So these are the Ys of the alphabet that are vowels, and all the others are the primitive types. Yeah.
So we said earlier these primitive types are always passed by value.
Yes.
So we can define them to be passed by reference if we want them to, right?
You can wrap them in a class, and then the class itself will be passed by reference. So yeah, you can do that. There's a thing called boxing that's been recently added to Java, which allows you to pass them by reference, but that's getting all fancy, and let's not go there yet. Okay. A class type is the opposite of a primitive type. It's a type you make. What does it mean to execute? It means to run. What does it mean to run? It means to execute. It means follow the instructions. The instructions, or do it. It means tell your computer, start at the first instruction, do the next one until you're done. Double should be started with a lowercase letter because it's a primitive type. It's a floating point. It's a double precision floating point value. Basically, it's what you use when you do math. Break.
Is that word double
Precision.
precision? Okay.
Yes. Double precision floating point. By double precision, I mean people used floats for many years, but floats could only allow up to 6 decimal places. Doubles allow up to like 18 decimal places. If you want to get technical, you can Wikipedia it for the IEEE standard on the size of the mantissa and the number of bits that are allocated for the exponent. And there's a whole bunch of electrical engineering that goes into worrying about, you know, how the bits in your computer represent scientific notation for a floating point value. Long story short, use these to do math. Break. In a debugger, that means pause or stop or wait here until I give you the command to step over or into the next instruction. There's also a little command called break, which means get out of the loop. Haven't talked about that yet. If you're inside of a for loop and you want to say if some condition occurs, stop this loop right now, just go to the next instruction. Break is a command that will do that, by the way. Just so you know it exists. You probably don't need to remember that, but actually maybe you do. A class is a custom type. It's a thing you can make that has a bunch of types in it. It's how you put things together to make a template for objects. And objects are instantiations of classes. I can't do that because I already had the word instantiate up here, so I'm making circular definitions. An object is a piece of memory with values in it that follow the pattern described in the class. Does that make sense? A procedure is a set of instructions to follow an ordered set of instructions. A function is like a procedure that returns a value. A method is a function that is a member of a class. Here's the way to remember it. Procedure, function, and method, they're all about the same thing. There you go. There are technical differences between them, but I wouldn't waste your brain cells worrying about it. People just throw out the words function, methods, and procedures to mean something that can be called. You call a method or a function or a procedure to do the instructions. Now, there are mathematical reasons why the word function is used when a value is returned, and method implies that it's part of a class for editing member variables, things like that. A member is part of a class. What is a parameter? It's an argument. It's something that you pass to a procedure, method, function. It's a value that can be passed by value or by reference, depending on whether it's a primitive or a class type. And it's going to tell the function what to do, what to compute. It's the things you need to perform the procedure. Okay? An argument is a parameter. There are slight technical differences between parameters and arguments. I can't even remember exactly what they are. Long story short, that's not worth worrying about the difference. They're values you pass to your procedure to run. A number with no decimal. A reference. A reference is actually also a number, but it tells you where in memory it is. Tells where in memory an object is. I like to think of a reference as an arrow. Whenever I draw a diagram and there's an arrow, that's a reference. In this case, W is a variable, a reference variable. It references this object. That wrapper object right there. Okay? A pointer is a fancy word for a reference. And some languages differentiate between pointers and references and some don't. In Java, they're the exact same thing, and I wouldn't worry about the difference if I were you. The pointers and references are just a number that says where in memory the object is. A string is a built-in class that holds an array of chars. What's a char? Yeah, a character, a space, a number, a symbol, something like that. There's another word, literal. A literal is in code when you actually provide a value like 17 or taco. When you specify a value explicitly in code like that, it's called a literal. This is a string literal. This is an integer literal. And you often initialize your variables with literals. I'm betting that's a term that doesn't come up. That's kind of an obscure one, so maybe don't worry too much about that one. But yeah. A character, we already talked about that one. It's an 8-bit primitive type. You know, I say it's 8-bit, but in Java it's actually 32 bits because Unicode used to be 8 bits. In other languages. Basically, it's a letter-ish. A type is another way of saying class. Although type includes both primitives and class types, so it's not quite the same as class. It tells what type your objects are. My words are failing me now. I've used so many words, I think I'm going to run out. Sorry. Somebody else give me an explanation. What's a type? A template, a description. Something like that. A variable. Something that holds a value. A value. What a variable holds. Okay. Terminology. I'm sorry it exists. I wish it didn't need to, but it does. And now we can communicate much better.